There is a huge difference between appeasing the middle ground narrative and controlling the middle ground narrative. In other words, a huge difference between one, watering down your radicalism to appeal to or appease the middle, which is a bad strategy, versus two, reframing the radical in moderate terms without watering it down, which is a good strategy. Welcome to a special episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, part of a new sub-series we'll be running on some Saturdays. We're calling this new sub-series Sovereignty Saturdays, and the common theme to these episodes will be a focus on countering attempts by the US government to annex Canada with an environmental lens. But these episodes are going to be about more than just that, because to protect Canada's sovereignty and with it the communities and environments we know and love, we need to understand why it's under threat. Around the world, democracy is under attack, and far from secondary environmental and energy issues are core to understanding why that's happening. The erosion of rights and democracy anywhere harms us all and hurts our ability to address climate change, biodiversity loss, and to make the changes we need to make to have a safe, renewable future. Wealthy polluters have identified that their main obstacle to continuing to profit from pollution is democracy. I'm your host, Connor Curtis, Head of Communications at Sierra Club Canada, and today's episode is about truthfully communicating with others in the middle on an issue without giving up any ground in the process. But first, as you will have heard, the pipeline MOU has been announced between the federal and provincial government of Alberta, so here's our take on that. By scrapping the emissions cap, the federal government has betrayed the climate survivors of wildfires and floods in Canada who travelled to Ottawa last year to call for an emissions cap on Canada's biggest corporate polluters, oil and gas corporations. And who will profit from this betrayal? US shareholders. As the Energy Mix covered on Friday before this podcast came out, the four companies that represent 80% of Canadian oil sands production are 73% foreign-owned, 60% American-owned. They are sending a large share of their profits to their shareholders in the United States, even as they lobby to weaken Canadian climate policy, quote, like a Trojan horse for Donald Trump's pro-fossil, anti-climate politics. They've cut jobs in Alberta even when oil production has expanded. And as we'll talk about, they cannot promise a future in terms of revenue for provinces like Alberta. There was a lot of media coverage of Sierra Club Canada's response to the pipeline MOU announced on Thursday between the Alberta and the federal government. We talked to CBC News and City News Edmonton on video. We also covered by the T and L'Agence France Presse and from their several international outlets. And were covered by BNN Bloomberg, the Canadian Press, and from there in many other outlets with one message. This pipeline has no market, no private sector proponent, and no business case. So why are we scrapping climate policies for it, and why aren't we investing this sort of effort and ambition into building up renewables? The MOU does not seem to have done much to diminish separatist sentiments on the ground in Alberta, as City News Edmonton reports, and I'll link to that below. Because lies cannot bring unity. Only the truth can do that, no matter how brutal that truth is. And the truth is, again, that that pipeline has no business case. As well as standing with First Nations and our allies in British Columbia to oppose this ridiculous pipeline, we plan to continue advocating for a renewable path forward. Sierra Club Canada are already organizing events around renewable skills training for communities. We'll continue fighting disinformation on renewables because wind, solar, and battery storage are what the world is adopting. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, precisely because no one wants to rely on volatile oil and gas controlled by hostile countries or subject to international crises beyond their control. Wind, solar, and battery storage are the real solutions for energy independence, not expensive, slow, and wasteful gas and nuclear power that this MOU is foolish enough to promote. As our executive director Gretchen Fitzgerald put it, where is the MOU for truly clean energy sharing? Where are the renewable solutions provinces like Alberta really need? There are certainly wind and solar companies that would like to invest in Alberta but have been driven away by provincial policies. The future of all our provinces and our democracy depends on Canada going renewable. Revenue losses provincial governments will face in the next decade as global oil and gas demand dries up amount to 85% in Alberta, from $153 billion to $23 billion, 72% in British Columbia, from 74 billion down to 13 billion, 78% in Saskatchewan from 16 billion to 3.5 billion, and nearly 100% in Newfoundland and Labrador from 4.4 billion to 300 million. You can take action right now by calling your MP and expressing your concerns, or by signing one of the petitions I'll link to below. And you're not alone in being concerned about this MOU. We've heard from you on what projects of national interest you'd like to see. You helped fill out a form, many of you, and sent us your project of national interest that you wanted to see. And you wanted to see things like a national east-west electrical grid, wind and solar power, and high-speed passenger rail. And we've recently summarized in our newsletter all of the things you sent to us. 72% of Albertans wish to maintain or increase federal climate action and action to transition the country to clean energy. In March, polling showed 65% of Canadians want renewables instead of oil and gas development, and polling in June confirmed 67% now prefer renewables and clean energy generally to oil and gas development, and it's 77% in BC. As we pointed out in the last edition of our Sovereignty Saturdays podcast on the pipeline MOU, the MOU on this imaginary West Coast pipeline is actually covered to weaken Canada's climate regulations, create room for oil and gas corporations to strengthen ties with the United States, and slow the growth of renewable energy in Canada. Because renewable energy is Canada's best bet for continuing our sovereignty. Sierra Club Canada was also recently featured in the news by the Energy Mix de Narwhal and a National Observer on the Government of Canada's erosion of climate policies and endorsement of a West Coast oil pipeline. So how do you go about talking to others? That's the big focus of today's podcast, the rest of which I wrote before this MOU came out, so keep that in mind. Now, a big part of what we've talked about on the Sovereignty Saturdays podcast so far is how to give communities in Canada more power of their energy by encouraging renewable energy growth, and how the environmental and climate movement have a vital role to play in helping to defend democracy and defend Canada and all that we love from US aggression. But there are a lot of ways to go about it, and you're probably wondering, how do I get people around me to start putting up solar panels and electrifying things? How do I reach out to my community, and how do I work with them once I do? We often get questions about our somewhat unique approach to reaching out to others at Sierra Club Canada, and we actually just had an internal chat that covered some of those questions that's coming out as a podcast this coming Tuesday. And specifically, the questions tend to revolve around, why do we at Sierra Club Canada do a bunch of work on a subject like, say, countering climate misinformation, and then also at the same time build plant gardens or host hikes across Canada? Why does Sierra Club Canada advocate for the legal rights of nature, a very official task and legal task, and then at the same time organize beach cleanups and yoga sessions? In short, the question is, why do we do so much in so many different fields of environmental action and run events that don't fit the normal mold of protest action? And I get that externally this might seem chaotic sometimes, and we are a member-led organization. People in Sierra Club Canada do start their own initiatives, and then we do try to support them. But behind all of this diversity of initiatives is strategy. We've talked before about how we work to be the glue of the environmental movement, and this approach is precisely how we do that. What I mean is this. Let's say you want to go help counter climate misinformation in a community. Now, you could do the typical thing and work into that community with a whiteboard, or hold a lecture or a protest, or drop off a bunch of flyers, and that would probably do some good. I'm not discounting those tactics. But I would be willing to bet most people who go to that lecture or protest or get something out of that pamphlet are likely to be the people who already agree with you. Instead, let's imagine you take a different approach. You go in and organize a cleanup or tree planting event in the community. Things that hold a broad appeal first. You get people to come out and talk with each other, first of all, on something common to their community, the trees around them, or the need to address local waste. People outside the normal environmental circle get involved. And now, when you go back and do that lecture or protest or distribute those pamphlets on climate misinformation, you've got a lot more people showing up who actually need to hear what you have to say, because they already know you and are open to what you've got to say, even if they don't fully agree with you yet. Now, when you're fighting that legal battle over the rights of nature, you can call on a lot of people to sign that petition to government or to spread the word about what you're doing in court. And it's because you got outside the normal bubble of environmental action first. As I've talked about before, protests, town halls, tree plantings, lawsuits, cleanups, meetings with your MP, press releases, social media posts, these are all tools in a tool belt. No one tool is the answer to every situation, and each has its own use. And the tools you use should be determined by the intersection of your overall strategy and the immediate reality you are facing. For instance, legal cases can be very effective, and we at Sierra Club Canada do join them pretty frequently. But as we are seeing in the United States right now, the law has limits when a few wealthy interests can control the perception of what is legal. At a certain point, leaders simply choose to disobey the law if they think they can get away with it in the court of public opinion. That's where communications tools like newsletters and social media and emails and press releases and even podcasts come in. They help us stand up to the framing those wealthy interests are using to distort reality and buy space for legal actions and other actions to have an actual impact. I want you to keep this idea of a tool belt of tactics in mind as we discuss today's subject. Today, I am going to be talking to you about how to reach to people beyond the climate action bubble and share a few thoughts on two topics I see being discussed a lot. Should we appeal to the middle ground or be radical in our calls for climate action? And how should we advocate for climate change in a united way? I'm going to argue these are false dichotomies, and at the core, it's not about being radical or not. It's about holding to the truth and expressing that truth in ways that people actually understand. Now, my podcast co-host Jessica Murray did a great episode on why the answer to the first question is in both being radical and reaching out to the middle. Please go check out that episode on full spectrum resistance, which I will link to in the description. Full spectrum resistance is a really useful approach that very much embodies what we do at Sierra Club Canada, but I also want to mention some insights on this issue from my own analysis of how climate denialists have successfully engaged with the middle to shift the center of the discussion further towards their viewpoints. The biggest insight being that there is a huge difference between appeasing the middle ground narrative and controlling the middle ground narrative. In other words, a huge difference between 1, watering down your radicalism to appeal to or appease the middle, which is a bad strategy, versus 2, reframing the radical in moderate terms without watering it down, which is a good strategy. Further, within that good strategy of reframing, you might use reframing so as to either A, convert moderates, quote unquote, into thinking more radically, i.e. shifting the center of the debate or encouraging critical thinking, and or B, buy space for radical change by using moderate arguments that buy reputational space for radical action, i.e. showing that opposition to what you want to achieve is itself unreasonable. I've created some illustrations which I will link to in the description to help illustrate these points. You might want to go to them to refer to what I'm discussing in the following. The bad approach, watering down your arguments, might gain you some support of moderates, but it leaves you stranded in the middle, having betrayed a radical base of support. See figure 1 in that illustration I linked to. And likewise, being radical but ignoring the middle comes with its own problems. See figure 2 in the guide, like infighting. The second approach, the better approach, both promotes and makes space for the radical by engaging with the middle but keeping the radicality intact. See figure 3. Jessica Murray did another great episode with Anat Shankar-Osayo, who has more recently also talked about the power of magnetism to a cause. I will link to that podcast that Jessica did in the description, which goes into framing, and you might want to check that out. But here's an example of what I mean about the difference between watering down your message versus reframing it. Say you want to convince people of the radical, quote-unquote, position that we should convert our energy system over to renewable energy, wind and solar, rather than relying on oil and gas. Note, I'm using radical here to refer to things few would see as radical, but some people in the center might still see that way. Making the mistake of watering down the radical to try and appeal to the middle might take the form of saying, for sure, renewable energy will not be the solution for a long time, but we should start building it up. This statement attempts to appeal to the middle by sacrificing the radical. It doesn't buy space for a message, nor convert others. It just reinforces the false notion that renewable energy isn't ready. Versus a good reframing for a middle ground audience of almost exactly the same argument might take the following two forms. A, you might aim to convert people in the middle by reframing the radical as the middle by saying something like, I bet you no one thought we could replace horse-drawn carts with cars in the early 20th century, but it happened. The same is true of renewables replacing oil and gas. It can and will happen, and we should lead that change for the benefit of our climate and economy. Otherwise, we'll be the people using horse-drawn carts as everyone else gets cars. This statement takes the radical notion and, without watering it down, makes it comprehensible by using a point of reference a moderate-leaning person can actually refer to and understand. It can convert a person to seeing the radical as acceptable, thus shifting the center of the debate. Or another good approach you might take. You might not aim to convert somebody outright, but you might rather aim to make space for a radical argument by saying something like, maybe you still believe in building more oil and gas infrastructure, and I disagree with you. That's the important part of this sentence on that. But surely you can agree we should also build out wind and solar as well, since they can create a lot of jobs right now. This doesn't say that you agree with the other argument. It doesn't discount renewables as deployable right now. It simply says we disagree, but surely you can see the benefit in this. This statement isn't itself radical. It doesn't attack an opposing view, but it makes it harder for someone in the middle ground to be convinced by someone else to oppose a changeover to renewable energy. That's valuable. This approach is useful in that it buys reputational space for radical change. It doesn't convert people or get them to support you, but it does buy space for your radical, quote-unquote, viewpoint without sacrificing anything or agreeing to anything you don't actually believe. Which at the end of the day is just the truth. You should be talking to people even if you disagree in terms of the truth. What matters is the framing of the truth, not watering down the truth. Another example. Let's say there's a big peaceful climate protest downtown in your city, and you're talking with a friend who is critical of protesting in general. A bad, appeasing to the middle ground type of argument to make would be to say something like, oh yeah, protesting goes too far. I agree with what they're saying, but they shouldn't do that. A better way of putting this, controlling the middle ground argument's way of putting it, would be to say something like, hey, you might not agree with the protest, but can you really blame them for protesting given the damage climate change is having? I mean, people are losing homes. The sky is full of smoke every summer. I get why people would be protesting. Or you might say something like, people have always protested when things are wrong. It should come as no surprise to you that they're doing so now. After all, if climate deniers can use both sidesism to their advantage while also radicalizing people at the same time, there are also strategic ways when climate deniers are trying to make points that we can use both sidesism and radicalization to our advantage as the climate concerned. These framing tactics have been used by climate deniers to obfuscate the truth and to push other agendas. But there's no reason this reframing can't also be used to fight for the truth. And that, at the end of the day, is the most important thing we can do. Stay truthful, because the truth is radical enough. And it leads me to address another common problem within the environmental movement. We are a little prone to friendly fire. That is understandable. We are, all of us, watching the world go through a period of extreme difficulty, and nature is going through a time of great destruction. We are, all of us, passionate about wanting to protect the world. And let's face it, as the climate movement, our communications have not always helped. For a while, a lot of the climate movement did focus on destruction and emotions like anger and outrage as a means to generate change. And these are legitimate emotions and powerful emotions. But unless they are paired with hope and with problem solving and with community, they are also aimless emotions. And aimless anger can lead us to turn on each other. Because let's face it, it can seem easier at times to fight each other than to fight the big polluting corporations, the wealthy interests, and the now hostile US government that sees Canada as a potential conquest. But we cannot win unless we win. We cannot prevent climate change from getting worse unless we fight the big polluters. And we cannot face the United States government unless we stand up to them. And so let me share 11 key tips in this respect to avoid conflict with others on the same side as you, and to figure out when maybe somebody isn't on the same side as you. First of all, understand that sometimes we do have legitimate reasons to have debates within a movement. We might not be able to work with everyone because there are sometimes bad faith actors out there. There are also systemic injustices, even within well-meaning movements, that need to be addressed. But consider this, even if you cannot work with someone, how much energy do you plan to spend debating those with shared fundamental values versus standing up to big polluters or actually growing renewable energy? Even simply respecting yourself enough to conserve your energy for the bigger fights that we need to win can be a vital first step. I pass no judgment here on how you choose to go about this or what balance you choose to strike, but let me give you two examples. If you spend 2 hours debating the color of the background of a social media post and miss your window for the best time of day to post it, then your debate did more harm than either the deep purple or bright pink background color you could have had in that post. If you discuss the details of a protest endlessly in your meeting such that the window for that protest to have an impact is missed, then you have achieved little other than having a discussion. Time is a resource. Use it wisely. Accuracy in reading your audiences is important to get better at, but accuracy does not matter if your target audience has moved from where it was by the time you're ready to communicate. The same is true of arguing with people who will never agree with you. As I've said many times before, if you measure your progress by how many climate deniers you convinced not to be climate deniers, you will have limited success and waste a lot of time. At the same time, if you only ever speak to other members of the climate concern, you might feel better, but you won't have achieved much outside the bubble. The trick is first to identify who is really on the fence and who is persuadable and to convince them, and to keep in mind that some climate deniers will want you to argue with them because they know it is a waste of your energy that you could use to talk to others. Secondly, focus on a shared common goals set, even if you disagree on how to achieve those goals, provided, and this is important, the other person really does share the same goals. Understand that not everyone will agree in strategy, even if they agree on objectives, and not everyone will agree on tactics, even if they agree on strategy. And not everyone will talk about messages in the same way to different people, and all that difference can actually be perfectly fine. A key element of full spectrum resistance is having multiple strategies and tactics directed towards the same goal. But be sure that goal really is the same first, and boil things down to a bottom line change you want to see. Oil and gas corporations, for instance, may claim that they aim to lower emissions and help solve climate change, but they are clearly lying and have lied for decades, so do not work with them. By contrast, if your friend is a committed climate activist and you are a committed climate activist and your debate is over whether to hold a protest or whether to run a letter writing campaign, understand the person across the room is not the enemy, and maybe try both tactics and compare notes on which worked better so you know what to do next time. And if someone really is there just to undermine the work you're doing, maybe just don't engage with them. Assess if they are really capable of undermining what you're doing. If you should choose simply not to engage with them, or simply ignoring them might be enough. Keep in mind, if someone enters an environmental space with the aim of causing disruption, a big part of their goal is to start fights, to drain energy that you could be using to expand a movement or win victories. So stay focused on the goals you actually want to achieve. And while it's important to have consistent goals that everyone can keep a focus on, keep in mind that strategies may change and they may need to. Tactics might change. So never get so focused on using one strategy that you wouldn't settle for an even better strategy, even though your baseline goal should stay the same. Third, take a step back. Maybe you're really aware of environmental issues right now, but I am willing to bet you were not always aware of them. I'm willing to bet that there were people in your life who helped shape your views, who, for lack of a better word, radicalized you. Take some time to seriously ponder how that happened. How did you get here? Then you will be more equipped to get other people to the same place. I'll admit, I had problems with this one myself. I'm the sort of person who drinks too much coffee, works far too much, and thinks about work even when I'm not at my desk, and rarely takes a break. And I am actually grateful to the people who have helped me slow down, at least for a while, and reconnect to myself and the world. Again, I'm going to recommend you check out some of the work of Jessica Murray, Sierra Club Canada in this respect, and the work that reconnects, which I'll link to in the description. I will always be the coffee drinking, overworking person that I am, obsessed with communication strategy and tactics, who talks in terms of phrases like controlling the narrative and winning the argument, because that is who I am. And that has value, I hope, to the climate movement. But some of my best ideas and strategies came to me only after I took a step back and let go, even for a few hours. And I know our strength at Sierra Club Canada, at least, comes in part from the fact that not everyone I work with sees things through the frames and metaphors that I do. You can also practice strategic empathy, which means you do not fall for the framing of an opponent in a debate. You maintain your position and do not water down what you believe in, but you seek to understand why your opponent came to their worldview in order to ensure others do not fall into the traps they clearly did, and in order to understand how they will attempt to convince others of their viewpoints. Fourth, understand the power of forgiveness. And here I don't mean being naive about others' intentions or the worst that people are capable of. Some people are out to undermine you. You do need to stand up to bullies. You do need to protest. You do need to call out leaders and CEOs and lobbyists. Forgiveness is not free when someone or corporation has done a great wrong. Oil and gas corporations' debt to the world for all of the damage they have done to the climate, to democracy, to security and well-being of so many people is a debt that those corporations will never functionally be able to pay off. It is so large. And the only way an oil and gas company could do any good is to go 100% renewable without any delay. But the most successful movements do forgive individual people when it is earned. You should not waste time arguing with climate deniers, but if somebody does truly say they recognize they have a problem, then perhaps there is room for change. Climate denial functions in many ways a bit like an addiction. It is an addiction to a self-affirming worldview that has spiraled out of focus. It's an addiction to the adrenaline of quote-unquote owning others, no matter the consequences of doing so. You cannot help somebody if they are unable to recognize that climate denial is a problem. But if they do recognize that there is something wrong in what they have been doing, there is a chance for change. Fifth, no matter who you support, don't worship leaders. If a leader becomes more important to you than the thing you want them to achieve, if you put them above criticism, then you not only harm yourself, but you harm them too. Remember, as soon as they are in power, all leaders will be swept up in a world of corporate lobbyists and will be encouraged to lose their connection to you. As we talked about in our previous Sovereignty Saturdays episode, The Real Deep State, worshipping leaders is a recipe for disappointment. Not because political leaders are inherently good or bad, but because that's not how democracy is supposed to function. Leaders are supposed to be the means to an end, a tool by which people hold power. Not heroes we look up to, but people we will always need to push on to do better once in office. You are the hero when you stand up to hate or advocate for our environment, or call your MP, when you counter climate misinformation, when talking to others, and when you counter annexationism and 51st statism. Engaging with leaders, whether it's in the form of voting, calling your MP, or protesting outside the city council, is also just one tool among many to an end. And in doing so, focus on policy rather than political theater. What are the actual policies they are promoting? And remember, the policies you support need to survive, even if the political leader you like for implementing those policies does not implement them. One thing climate deniers get right is that they are motivated by their denial. Their engagement with politics is a means to an end, not an end in and of itself. No matter what happens, they do not stop promoting what they believe in, and they focus on their shared goal and keep their movement together. We can learn from that. And we can learn from the oil and gas corporate lobbyists who know that election time is vital, but it is also only one point in time when you can influence leadership. And so they put the work in the years in between to influence leaders and the structures that determine how we frame issues. Sixth, keep things in perspective. Talk to people outside of your bubble, not for the sake of becoming more moderate about change we need to see, but for the sake of knowing how to communicate with others and what metaphors and framing they use to see the world, and how to hopefully recognize just how much we all have in common, fundamentally, even if we disagree on the specifics. Seventh, focus on net benefit and stay ambitious about your goals. How does what you are doing move the needle of progress towards a renewable, democratic, and more equal world? Did you meet your goal? Take that step back and ask yourself, did you move things forward today? And if so, no matter how much, ask how and try again tomorrow. Again, I like to use a gym metaphor here. You can go to the gym and set the goal of lifting light weights and easily achieve that goal, but you might not really achieve any benefit. You can go to the gym and overwork yourself by trying to bench 200 pounds on your first day and injure yourself such that you no longer are able to work out. Or you can set an ambitious goal to lift heavy weights and each time incrementally push yourself a little further past what you previously saw as possible, resting in between each attempt until you achieve that ambitious goal. You will find that if you set ambitious goals and work with others to get there in ways that are healthy, while carefully monitoring what works and what doesn't, a lot of disputes will end before they even begin. Eighth, understand the value of hidden support or partial support. Not everyone can support what you are doing outright, even if they agree with you. And that can even be an advantage if it brings you information you would not otherwise have access to or helps pave the way for changes you want to see. Sometimes the support you receive that goes unseen is more important than a declaration, provided it is real support. encourage people to do what they can and see how what they have to offer might open up new opportunities or fit together with existing ones. Changing things from the inside or the outside of a system can at times be a false dichotomy. There are always people who can either fix or erode destructive systems from the inside, even as others from the outside build newer, better systems that replace or fill gaps left by the old systems. The environmental movement is an ecosystem, not a monoculture, and we all have different roles to play in that ecosystem, so long as our concern is to actually keep it alive. And that approach can extend outside the environmental movement as well to understanding how to engage with the larger media ecosystem in which we operate. For example, we have a huge problem in Canada that a lot of our media is owned by US companies with sympathies to big oil and gas and the US administration. And I will be the first to criticize the sort of coverage that a fair amount of mainstream media in general often gives to issues like climate change. And I have critiqued it. And I have probably angered some journalists and editors by doing so. And I am fully for funding the CBC adequately, even if I sometimes criticize their coverage too. But I also recognize that there are many, many journalists and editors who are working at mainstream media outlets who are trying to do good reporting and may not always be phrasing things the way that I would prefer, but are honestly doing their best. And I have a lot of respect for that, even if they don't always agree with me. And I would hope those journalists, in turn, respect that we at Sierra Club Canada will not mince words when it comes to the both sides of issues, and that when they reach out to us for interviews, as they often do, it is not because they like us personally, but because of the importance of ensuring environmental voices are featured in coverage of climate and energy issues. That doesn't mean I don't also make sure to support independent journalists and outlets who are doing important investigative reporting and who are often more likely to take a more critical stance on oil and gas corporations. Nor does it mean that I forgive the editorial decisions that have clearly been taken by some mainstream media outlets at a higher level to both sides' issues like climate change, where one side is clearly right and the other side, oil and gas corporations, has a decades-long history of purposefully lying. Ninth, care about the content and intention more than phrasing. Keep in mind, some people might phrase things well, but their intention may not be great, while others might not phrase things well or might use metaphors or framing you are not familiar with, but their intention might be good. I see this online a lot, where many in the environmental movement are so used to getting trolled that even when someone agrees with us, we might think they are trolling us. And I'm talking about people literally misreading sentences and assuming the worst. And from a polling perspective, remember, 80 to 89% of the world's people want their governments to do more to address climate change. Climate deniers are disproportionately represented online, and they want it that way because they want you to think you're alone. So when talking to others, when you're reading something that you're unsure of, take a moment, step back, and ask them to explain again. In soccer, you often have to stop the ball and take control of it once it's past you before kicking it somewhere else. This is why sometimes being non-reactive is better, because you could otherwise face a rhetorical trap. And again, this is why hope is a better motivator than anger. If you're angry all the time, you might well get angry at someone else who's actually on your side simply because you misread what they said, or you might fall for the bait somebody leaves who isn't on your side, but they leave that bait in an argument for you to fall for. It's not to say there aren't legitimate debates to be had, or that you should put up with disrespect. It's to say don't let the trolls win. Don't let them get inside your head. Sometimes not reacting immediately is the better course. Sometimes perfect grammar is less important than a good intent and desire for factual discussion. Sometimes someone is actually talking to another audience and has phrased things in a certain way to reach out to them, and that message may not be meant for you to hear, which is why it sounds strange. 10th, never punch down. Take on the truly powerful, not those the powerful use as shields and diversions. We've talked about this on the show before, but there is a common strategy on behalf of anti-democratic extremists, which is carried out by pushing hatred towards a marginalized group that they will frame as an other. The group these anti-democratic authoritarians will target might be a minority, like the transgender community. Most recently, it's been immigrants. Authoritarians don't care who the other is, but they will push and push on building up hatred and disdain for that group until they have enough power to destroy democracy itself, which is their end goal. This is a strategy on the part of authoritarians you should not fall for, and yet too many have tried to appease the center by selling out the marginalized. I'll link to, once again, the podcast by Robert Evans that goes into this tactic and the historical roots it has in 20th century Germany. It's entitled Carl Schmitt, The Mind Behind Modern Fascism, and the relevant section is in part 2 at about 45 minutes in. And finally, 11th, celebrate wins. If all you do is focus on losses, you will lose momentum. Make sure you count your wins, and you'll see many of the changes in the world you thought were unachievable are in fact possible. Take a deep breath and realize everything you do is going to be messy. The world is neither an optimistic place nor a pessimistic one. It is simply absurd. But you can make a difference, and momentum and community helps. I, for one, am very fortunate to work with a team of people who achieve the impossible and break expectations every single day. What I have shared with you here mostly comes from them. So I hope these insights help. And I'd like to end this podcast with a moment of strategic empathy for, of all people, oil and gas CEOs and lobbyists. I have long said, and will continue to say, that workers who work at oil and gas corporations are not to blame for climate change, division, and the hate we see around us, because that is the case. They are not to blame. And imagine getting out of high school and having the opportunity to earn the sort of money one used to be able to make in the oil patch. For any kid who came from any background of economic uncertainty, who can blame them for going into oil and gas? My dad did that for a while when he was young. I don't blame him for it. That's a structural issue, and we need to build up renewable energy alternatives precisely so workers have a real future, one that oil and gas companies can no longer provide since they are laying off workers even when they increase production these days. Climate change is not the fault of any worker. It is not the fault of oil and gas or coal workers or any other worker. It is the fault of wealthy oil and gas corporations and those who choose to advocate on their behalf. So to any oil and gas executives and lobbyists at the upper levels of those companies listening to this, understand, I do blame you. You willfully lied, are lying, not just to the public about climate change, but to your own workers about their economic future. Your lies led to what is happening in the United States and are eroding democracy in Canada too. You were not simply doing your job. You were not simply meeting demand. You attempted to control demand by attacking renewable energy, even as you put small, symbolic changes towards green initiatives so you could fool people into thinking you cared. You probably didn't start out doing bad things, but no amount of wanting to believe you're somehow doing good, no amount of romanticism about the golden days of oil and gas will make it less true that you're hurting everyone and even yourselves. When you look in the mirror and doubt if you do indeed care at all in what you are doing, that doubtful voice is right. You should listen to it. And if that didn't seem sympathetic at all, that's because there's a difference between empathy and sympathy. And just because I can feel empathy concerning the moral hole oil and gas executives and lobbyists have dug themselves into doesn't mean I think their actions and viewpoints are legitimate. I may not sleep much at night because my generation must fight the destruction of our environment, growing inequality, and the destruction of our democratic freedoms. 3 crises oil and gas executives and lobbyists have played a huge role in causing. But at least I have a clean conscience, and at least I have a sense of personal honor. And that is far preferable to me than sleeping well while having none. Before we end today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe to get the latest episodes from us. And hey, it's the giving season, so please consider a donation if you can to help us continue our work at Sierra Club Canada, like this podcast. And if you're unsure, go check out our website. That's sierraclub.ca and find out more about our team of staff and our board. Thank you.